Hello, I'm Michael Humphreys. This is the Lend Hoping Nothing podcast. I'm happy to be talking to you today. This is episode 31, and today I want to talk a little bit about Hyman Minsky, the instability or the financial instability hypothesis, and usury, as is my habit on this podcast. Talk about usury. Oh man. So, big thing that I'm really trying to figure out, and it's really the reason I'm talking about Minsky in the first place. I've mentioned him a couple of times in prior episodes, but the idea is I want to try to get sort of the perspective of the economist into my dissertation. This is one of the things that was suggested by my thesis director, was go out, see if there are some economist who is, not necessarily making the same exact argument as I am, because it's pretty much not going to happen, but, go and see what economic logic there might be out there to, link to Aquinas and then develop, some sort of argument against usury from the economic perspective. Now, I want to preface that with saying that I don't think that there is a, strictly speaking, economics proper argument against usury. I think there are good reasons for economics to reject usury. I think that economics relies on axioms or principles that imply the rejection of usury, but I don't think there is properly an argument from economics along the mode of economic reasoning that would strictly reject usury per se and completely. And the reason that I kind of think that is, if you look at Aquinas, one of the things that he recognized is that there is some sort of usefulness, there are some sort of goods that come out of usury existing in society. I mean, he says this about prostitution as well. It's not that it's good, it's that, without it, the common good would be harmed in these particular circumstances. And so this is the basis of his argument that civil law will tolerate usury. And so from a positive law perspective, it is better to tolerate usury than to suffer the evils or lack the goods that come from usurious loans. And so this is just a recognition that, there are economic goods that come from usury and from usurious loans. This is the exact argument that you will see almost everyone who either explicitly or implicitly embraces liberal economics will be, if the poor don't have access to usurious debt, they won't put it in usurious terms, but those who don't have access to usurious debt won't be able to pay their bills, or they won't be able to do X, or they won't be able to do Y, blah, blah, blah. And so that's as fine as far as it goes. And within the constraints of economics, okay, fine, that's a fairly reasonable argument. But the problem is that it's still intrinsically evil. And so it's still contrary to justice. And so in that respect, I don't think there can be a strictly economic argument against usury. Now, I recall, some years ago, Zippy Catholic, rest in peace, he had a quippy saying, it was usury is good business until it's not. And what I think he was getting at there was that, it's good for the lender. He keeps making his money just like normal until it stops, until there's nothing left. Because he's really relied on the human person as an asset. And you, at least currently, you can't go around selling people You can sell their information, you can sell, you can buy their wages and so forth, but you can't, not yet, explicitly and openly buy people. So, and so I think that's kind of what Aquinas is getting at as well. But it is bad business at a certain point, and that's kind of what I get from Hyman Minsky. I think there's kind of a point of contact there, and particularly in the way that he treats money and the way that Aquinas, especially relying on Aristotle, treats money. But I do think that from the principles that economics has to rely on, that implies that economics should reject usury. And this is my argument, as I've presented several times, that economics is really fundamentally grounded in property and the legal nature of exchange and exchange of property rights. And so the issue comes about that, well, economics takes property and property law for granted. So apart from some sense in which the thing is mine, there is no exchange, because there's no me giving you mine for yours. And so the whole category of exchange, which is the vast majority of economics, just falls apart. And also, there's no reason to actually go and create capital if there is no property, because I'm not going to go build a dam, or I'm not going to go farm a field or plant an orchard if any person can just come by and take any or all of it. Like, there's no point. There's no future orientedness to it. And so the basically economics is reduced to nothing but, what can I gather and consume at this moment? And so you have a radically reduced economics if you don't accept property. Now, usury is a violation of property. Therefore, in order for economics to exist, it needs to accept property and therefore reject usury. Now, I think that is an argument from economics, from its principles, against usury, but it's along a mode of thinking that is not proper to economics, is how I would kind of phrase that. I should probably come up with an analogy for that, because I feel like that's a point. I'm sure in one of the scholastic manuals or something they talk like that, because there are modes of reasoning that differ by science, and different sciences will have the same principles or rely on the same principles, but you might reason from them differently. So I think that from economics, from its principles, you can make an argument against usury, but I don't think from the mode of reasoning, value and the distribution of goods and preference and those sort of considerations, you could necessarily get to an argument against usury per se. Though I do think that argument I just made was a per se argument, because if you don't accept property per se, then economics falls apart. So, and so then I enter into Minsky with this respect, because I don't think he's going to provide a per se argument against usury, but I think that he does offer something worthy of note. So the first thing that he kind of talks about is this with the neoclassical theory, or the neoclassical synthesis is what it's called, which is kind of the mainstream economics. And so this has been around for decades now. And so there are known issues with it, and a lot of it kind of, the way that he presents it makes a lot of sense with what I've studied about economics, because I had to do some high-level study, introductory study of economics as part of my FSA and actuarial training. And so, we studied utility curves and supply and demand graphs and equilibrium prices and the quantity theory of money and so forth. And all of this more or less sounds familiar. Hyman presents it at a deeper level with more sophistication than I got in my actuarial training, but it sounds familiar. It has the right tone to it. And I've been reading some other books, like Economic Thinking in the 21st Century Towards a Renewed Understanding of Money and Capital from a System-Wide Perspective. And so the neoclassical synthesis, one of the big things that Minsky will criticize is the way in which it proceeds from a sort of a barter system. And so, for example, in this book, it talks about the Walrasian. The guy's name is Walrus, which a French neoclassical economist, Walrus, probably was less bad than it sounds in English. Because every time I look at the Walrasian paradigm, I think, gosh, big fat toothy sea lion things. But I go astray. And it's basically, the paradigm is basically a barter system without money. And so you have this kind of analysis of supply and demand, of how much you'll exchange for what type of goods and so forth. And you're trying to optimize utility functions and so forth. And money only really comes in. Yeah, and it has this whole auctioneering logic to it. But money only comes in to the theory through the quantity theory of money. And so the quantity theory is, so it's MV equals PQ. And so P is essentially the vector of all the prices of all goods. So milk costs $2, eggs costs $50 now probably, flour costs $3, so on and so forth. And then Q is the vector of the actual goods exchange. So you have prices times goods. And that's going to equal M, which is the amount of money, and then V, which is the average velocity, so how fast it's being exchanged. I imagine there's a more I hope there's a more formal definition of velocity there, but it just says average velocity. But the idea there is you have the price of goods, the amount being exchanged is equal to the amount of money times the speed at which it's being exchanged. And so that gives you kind of this way of being able to determine the the monetary price of things, because in the barter system you just have good for goods, and somehow you need to translate those goods into actual money terms. Interestingly enough, I was recently reading a paper there, or another paper that was arguing that I think it was in the 80s, the late 80s, early 90s, the quantity theory of money was breaking down because velocity was decreasing without a concomitant, decrease in prices or quantities, which makes me kind of wonder how you measure those things. But there's another guy that I'm starting to read. I haven't gotten very far, unfortunately, but Richard Weiner. He's German, so you pronounce the W V, right? So, um, and so he has a credit theory of money where he says that money is credit. Obviously, that's wrong, but it's a different direction to take things. Um, Money is not credit. Don't let anyone ever tell you that. Some credit is money, but not all money is credit. Unless you have radically impoverished use of those terms, um, or radically redefined ways of using those terms, which I find it seems like economists. Anyway, back to Heinemann. So the issue he has there is that money kind of enters in as this sort of abstract way of getting from the barter system to just prices, and it's problematic for him, especially because when we think about highly developed capitalist economies, the issue that begins to arise is you actually need to finance investment. And this is part of his whole thing, is that money actually enters in a radical way from the start of the analysis, which I think I may have mentioned this in a prior episode, but that seems to be exactly the approach that Aristotle takes, where, yeah, he starts with the barter system, but then he moves to now we're going to be talking about money and how money radically changes the way people engage in exchange, and how it looks like its own sort of wealth. And indeed, it looks like the true wealth. But I digress. Again, so Hyman, he looks at this and he's like, no, we need to look at this from the start, because if you look at capital investment as a separate price or a separate market, it acts radically different from the current commodity market. Because in the commodity market, you're buying things because you need them more or less immediately. Whereas in the asset market, you're looking for income that goes into the future and goes so far into the future that it's completely uncertain. Not just that you can have some sort of probability distribution, like with mortality in a life insurance company, which he literally says this is not the type of uncertainty he means. But when the uncertainty is just radical uncertainty, and he gives the example of, well, no one knows whether technology X today will be completely obsolete in 20 years. And so we've seen this historically, like with the invention of the car. Like there were whole industries that disappeared with the introduction of cars. Because nobody rode horses anymore, so you don't need anybody cleaning up the horse poop or dealing with those horse related things. And so you have this radical shift in the economy. This entire industry disappears, and so that's the type of uncertainty he's talking about, and that is what capital assets are based upon. And he'll talk about the different pricing. This example was given by an author who was writing related to Minsky. So I don't know if Minsky gave it. But you have commodity markets. And so what happens in commodity markets? Exactly what that whole barter system's talking about. You have an intersection of demand and supply. Prices go up. Oh, okay. Well, then demand goes down because people can't afford as much. But suppliers will increase supply. Or wait, I should probably reframe that. So if demand goes up, then the prices go up, and suppliers will be induced to generate more of the good. Whereas if demand decreases, the equilibrium price essentially goes down, and the supplier will supply less. And so it's a very demand-driven situation. And you can have cross impacts. So the price may be driven up because the particular goods or services or whatever need to be used in some other place with a higher price. But I digress once more. But there's that demand-driven aspect to it. And, if I've bought an apple and I see apple prices go up, I go, okay, I have my apple, good for prices. If they go down, I'm like, I have my apple, good for prices. I can go buy more when I need it. But it has much more to do with the intrinsic value of the apple rather than, the price. My concern about the price is only with regard to whether I can buy some more when I need it. Now, capital assets are very different because they're very future-oriented and they're driven by future expectations, which are largely unknown. And so, for example, when a stock price goes up, people are happy. But they don't want to see more supply. Like if the stock price went up and then the issuing company issued more shares, the stockholders would be upset because now their wealth has decreased. But also, stock price goes up. That is in itself a reason to buy. It's not a reason to buy less. It's not a reason to, in a budget constrained world to, buy less or reallocate to a different good. It's a reason to buy more because the price going up is an indicator that it will continue to go up, or at least that's the expectation. And so it's driven much more by expectation rather than demand. And so that is a radically different market than the commodity market, and it needs to be understood that way. And so you can see that in the GameStop debacle from a couple of years ago. Everyone just bought it, shot up. Because everyone knew it was going up. So they all bought some more and more and more just to, upset the people who had shorted it so that they would lose a ton of money. And terrible situation. But that's how that works. Not that it's a good thing, but that's how it works. And so it's a different sort of market that needs to be treated differently from the start of your economic analysis, not down the line. And this is Minsky's point. Getting to debt in particular, he'll say, one of his famous quotes is that stability is destabilizing, or equilibrium is disequilibrating. And what he means by that is that when we're in this theoretical equilibrium state of the market, where we have full employment and prices are beautiful, the sun shines every day, they're poor just being showered with money. What happens is bankers, so I should say investors, will look for ways to make profit. And so the ways to make profit are not always going to be ways that they can finance internally, so from their own income. And so then they'll look to bankers to provide external financing. And this whole external financing is what begins the process. Because bankers will look, they'll say, okay, well, there's an opportunity here. We expect these profits. Great. So with the constrained crediting system, they'll start giving out credit. Now, one of the things that Minsky shows is that profits increase with increased investment. And I understand the math. I understand, I think, the logic of it, but I don't understand it well enough to explain it. So take it for granted that with increased investment, there is increased profits. And so the bank gives money for the investment, and this goes in and starts generating profits after a number of years. And then the investor has to be paying the loan back as well. And so what happens is you start this investment that starts producing goods, which validates the expectations of the creditor in lending, because he had certain expectations of profits. And as long as those profits are validated, they actually come through, he'll be like, okay, that was a good idea. I lent and I made a profit. Aren't I the best? And so what goes on from there is like, okay, well, let's maybe loosen things a little bit, invest, lend some more. And what happens is you have greater lending, you have maybe potentially looser underwriting rules with time. But the issue, though, is that you've moved from this point of equilibrium, and you've started investing, and then you're starting to push, supply higher and higher, and pushing the investment higher and higher. And so you're actually pushing the economy out of equilibrium. And this is Minsky's point. But the issue, though, with the lending is that not every company is going to be able to pay back. And so he offers three groups. So there's the hedge unit, where they're generating enough income to pay back the interest and the principal. You have the speculative group, which only has enough to pay back the interest, and so they have to roll over the debt. So once the principal comes due, they have to enter into a new loan, and they use that loan to pay off the principal of the other one, and then start paying interest on the new one. And so part of what can happen there is when you have rates going up, those guys get in trouble because they have to refinance at higher rates. But then you have the worst group, which is the Ponzi group, or what Minsky calls the Ponzi group, and they're the ones who cannot pay the interest and cannot pay the principal. So they're kind of in the worst position. And what happens over time is that as the economy moves away from the theoretical equilibrium, is that these companies will not be able to generate the profits that they anticipated, and they'll potentially start moving into these other groups. So they might have started at a hedge and had sufficient income, but then they'll move into the speculative and the Ponzi, which is destabilizing to the economy. And what bankers will do is they'll start seeing, these are not being validated. Well, we're going to call up these loans rather than refinance. And so then those companies that can't pay back the principal, they'll start defaulting. And then the banks are going to start restricting credit more and more, tighten their underwriting. And so what you have is you start having a liquidity crisis where companies can't pay back and start defaulting. Banks don't have enough liquidity on hand for their liabilities, and so you start having this potential crisis, this development of instability, and you get a shock, an external shock that destabilizes the whole systems and sends you into a crisis. And that's all Minsky's whole argument. Now, how does this relate to usury? Because all of this can happen in non-usurious lending. So this seems almost exogenous or extrinsic to the whole issue of usury. Now, usury, I will argue, actually makes this whole thing worse. So in usurious lending, you're going to have not only the collateral to back the loan, but you're also going to have essentially your wages. So a bank might assume that you're going to repay your loan from your wages, but there's a difference whether they have recourse to the property alone or you personally. Now, if they have recourse to you personally, they might be able to garnish your wages or, come after all of your property, or just make you continue to pay regardless. So it's another layer of presumed collateral where you're treating the person himself as collateral that you can extract value from. And that's where it comes in, because it's another layer of it. And the problem that comes about with the whole process that Minsky lays out is that as this process goes along, asset values begin to rise, and you begin to have asset bubbles. And usurious lending is going to make that worse, because you're going to have people being treated as assets, contributing to the growth of that bubble. But when the bubble pops, you can't sell people, at least in America. So, yeah, and not explicitly. So, you have this whole issue where, and this is really, I think, what Zippy was getting at, was that when the bubble pops, you realize what the assets really are. So usurious lending actually makes this worse, because you're treating the assets as more than they are. Now, there's also empirical studies that suggest that there's a difference between recourse and non-recourse lending from an economic recovery perspective. And so there was one study I read that compared the United States to Europe. And Europe was treated as a strongly recourse regime. So you can go after the borrower for the return of the principal and interest. Whereas the United States was considered, at least practically, a non-recourse regime because of bankruptcy laws. Now, even within the United States, there was also another study done that compared different states, which some states are explicitly non-recourse and some that are recourse. And so what was discovered from those studies was that recourse regimes have a less hard fall in the crash, but they also have a much longer recovery time. Whereas non-recourse have a much sharper crash, but a shorter recovery. Now, the reason for that is, of course, in the recourse regime, yeah, you can recover some of your principal from the assets, but then you can also keep trying to recover it from the person. And so that blunts the crash, but it slows the recovery, because the borrower, when they're also trying to recover from this financial crash, they're burdened by this debt, and so their consumption is diminished for years into the future, which slows the economic recovery. Whereas in the non-recourse regime, yes, you have a sharper crash, so the banks and things will feel the hit harder, faster, but then you have a quicker return. And so they only have recourse to the property, so that hits hard, but then you have a faster recovery, because those borrowers who gave up the collateral are now free to essentially get to the level of consumption that they're capable of given their situation. And so they're unburdened by, every time I say unburdened, I think of that Kamala Harris quote. So they're unburdened by that debt. And so it goes off into the future that it's a quicker recovery. And so I think it's a really interesting argument there that you can make, that there's a few things that go on there, because it forces the bankers to be better with their underwriting from the start, because they know if something does happen, there's going to be a hit. And also that their only recourse is to the assets. And so even a profit-motivated bank is going to be compelled by law to, because of this legal recourse, to keep their credit lending within certain bounds. And so I think that provides a very strong reason. So it contributes to the stability of the economy if they do not have full recourse lending. Because they know they're going to be hit hard if something does fail. And so they need to be better with their underwriting. They need to be more prudent with their credit and lending. And then also, long-term economics, it's better for the economy because after an external shock or after something happens, you can get back to where you were faster. And so the overall health of the economy and the common good is actually improved as well. So I think there's a good argument there, and it's still this sort of practical prudential. It doesn't get to the individual loan itself, but it's something that says we should avoid recourse lending as much as possible. Because it's better for the economy to avoid it. It's better for the common good. So that's kind of where I think I'm going. And there's some significant connections between Aquinas and Aristotle and Hyman Minsky. Because, money as a means of exchange, like Aristotle talks about it as a surety of future goods, which sounds very much like Keynes, and Minsky talks about this a lot. Like there's a value to liquidity. There's a value to just having cash. It's more than just the means of exchange. Now that said, that would bring a challenge to other people's theory of usury, where it's like this equivalence of value. And so I think because of the way that I follow Aquinas and his view of restitution, I don't think it falls into the same trap. Because we're not returning the same value, we're returning the same thing. So that's kind of my thinking there. I'm reading this other guy, Richard Viner. Oh man, I remember when I was in doing Latin, and someone was trying to explain to me. I think it was like my second year Latin teacher. He was like, he was saying, well, actually in classical Latin, the V is pronounced like a W. And we know this because of, some ancient texts that would talk about how such and such word was like spoken like the way an owl hoots or something. But I always think about you have Julius Caesar, who is saying Vini Vidi Vici, and actually what he probably sounded like was Winnie Witty Witchy. Oh man, you just imagine like this great Winnie Witty Witchy. I don't know. I'm so sorry you guys have to listen to this sometimes. I should probably get an editor. Anyways, so that's kind of my thought, but the Richard Viner guy, I'm kind of interested to see where he takes it, because he's dealing with some of the same concerns that Hyman Minsky is addressing, but he's taking it from a different angle. I've only been able to read a little bit, and I think the quantity theory of credit, which is how he turns it, I really think economists just need to study philosophy, because I understand where he's going there, because he wants to talk about in money in terms of credit, which is really close to what Hyman Minsky's talking about. He's talking about how these bank debts and financial arrangements effectively create money, which is like, okay, we need to have a broader scope of money than currency, which is what Aquinas has. Da, 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 da. Aquinas is right again. But also, like, I'm curious where he's going to take that. I haven't had time. I only read the first few pages of his original article on it. So I'm curious if I can kind of connect the dots between Minsky and Wiener and Aquinas and Aristotle, because I really want to write an article, and I've started kind of brainstorming a presentation for the ACPA, the American Catholic Philosophical Association's conference this year, which is on tradition. And so what I'm thinking about writing is, Aquinas, Aristotle, philosophy, tradition, in dialogue with the modern economic tradition, which is a fundamental part of my dissertation. But we'll see how that goes. I mean, it's kind of interesting stuff. I think I have enough to write something on, like, just Aquinas and Minsky. But if I could, throw another economist into the mix, I think that'd be pretty cool too. So, but yeah, thanks for listening. Feel free to send me emails or anything. I'm always happy to chat and answer questions, or, if you guys want to call. I'm also happy to chat on the phone with people as well. And just today I got another email from someone who had some questions. So happy to talk. I'm happy to be wrong too, because I think it's valuable. Even if I'm wrong, I think it's valuable to get more people talking about this, because the more brain power that's behind it, the sooner we're going to be able to solve this. Because one of the things I despise about the way that it's treated economically is that there's such a lack of economic creativity. Like, usury is a problem. Well, the market will figure it out, and the market forces. Well, no, it doesn't. It hasn't. Let's stop being silly and actually think about what would be a solution. So, yeah. But yeah, thanks for listening. Give me a shout if you want to chat. Otherwise, have a good day. We'll talk to you later.